Welcome everyone. We're very happy to co-sponsor this event in celebration of 25 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have several guests who will speak and will make their comments, and then I will facilitate a conversation with some questions, and we will also open it up for you to ask questions and make comments. So with that, let me turn first to you, Commissioner.
Great, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I wanted to speak a little bit about the role of my office, particularly as it relates to ADA compliance and some of the things that I've seen just in the years that I've been commissioner at the city, but also just on a personal level, some of the things that I've seen as it relates to the ways that the ADA has changed my life, literally. And then talk a little bit about kind of some of the areas that where we need to go from here. So our office, as was mentioned, was started in 1990 by Mayor Daley. Originally it was an office that was connected with the senior community and disability under one umbrella. Mayor Daley split us up into becoming the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities right around the passage of the ADA. So our office will soon be 25 years as well. I think we're unique in that we are one of only a handful of cabinet level departments within city government. I'm appointed by the mayor, work at the pleasure of the mayor, and oftentimes what I see around the country, particularly in smaller or medium-sized cities, is an ADA compliance office or just simply a coordinator that might be buried under levels of bureaucracy and not have the level of ability to affect change or to bring attention to issues facing people with disabilities amongst the various departments. What I love about my job is that disability issues literally cover almost every single thing that the city does, whether it's events or providing information or helping people navigate services, or think about the libraries and the senior centers and the health departments and the taxi cabs and the CTA and housing, and there's literally a disability angle, I think, for almost all of what we do. So it definitely keeps us very busy. Our four main areas that we focus on that was mentioned earlier are direct services. So we provide a number of independent living services for people with disabilities. We do a lot of education and public awareness around disability issues. We also have a compliance unit that works on accessibility compliance, and a policy unit that works to initiate policy projects and also addresses legislation. So we really look at advise on city council ordinances that might be coming through as it relates to its impact on people with disabilities, or federal or state legislation as well. As it relates to the ADA, I think that's probably one of our areas that we work on most intensely. We really try to make sure that the city of Chicago is compliant not just with the ADA, but other federal, state, and local laws or codes that impact people with disabilities. We have both the architect, a disability rights attorney, and a disability policy analyst in our department whose job is to focus on, in many ways, ADA compliance and issues beyond just ADA compliance. So ways that the city can become more accessible, programs and services can be more usable for individuals with all types of disabilities. We play a big role in advising other city departments on how best they can serve the disability community. Through our plan review process, architects come in and can make an appointment with our office and schedule a time to have their plans reviewed before they get into the permit queue, so that we can make any corrections that might be needed before they're in the process of getting a permit. And this speeds up the process, but also works to assure better compliance. And then we also do accessibility permitting. So any building that's newly constructed or altered within the city of Chicago would come through our office. I can't speak, though, to how developers then go out and build a building and whether they build it compliant, because that has been a pretty big issue that we tend to see, particularly in area housing, that there might be shortcuts are taken or the plans aren't followed exactly. And so that's when the feedback comes back to us sometimes, that we hear complaints, and we do look into those as well. So that's a little bit about kind of our structure, but in terms of the initiatives that we take on, for a pretty small staff, we do a lot of advising on city infrastructure projects as it relates to accessibility compliance. So everything from, major projects like, the renovation of Navy Pier or the new Riverwalk, or we've done a lot of advising on the renovations of things like Wrigley Field, or the other stadiums, or public places, gathering places. We've done a lot on sidewalk cafes and helping to develop accessibility policies that would be connected with the permitting process. Worked a lot with Greg over here on even very simple things like scaffolding that gets erected, that folks who are blind or low vision, there's not adequate detectable warnings, and there's lamps hanging that they're hitting their head, or clothing is snagging, or there's not good cane detection. So we developed an advisory on how companies that are erecting scaffolding have to comply with the provisions that we've set out around accessibility. So there's a lot of different kinds of things that we do to not just assure compliance, but look at ways that we can incorporate accessibility requirements into things that we might not normally think about. So just in terms of, and then some of the other projects we work is not just physical access, but looking at things like information technology. How is our website accessible? Which now, with online applications and things of that nature, it's almost a virtual city hall. You can do so much of your business, whether it's getting information, applying for a permit, signing up for services, can be done online. So how is that accessible for people with disabilities, particularly those who are blind or low vision or deaf and hard of hearing? Looking at accessibility of events. So we advise a lot on high-profile events like Taste of Chicago or summer festivals, to make sure that things like seating and sign language interpreters and path of travel assistive listening devices are available. And then another big kind of ADA compliance issue that we work a lot on is emergency preparedness. And so we've advised worked really closely with the city's Office of Emergency Management and Communication on making sure that our city's emergency operation plans include the whole community. That includes people with disabilities. So how are we making all of those processes accessible, from communication? How do we communicate with the public that's accessible? How do we think about evacuation? How do we think about transporting people to shelter sites in a way that's accessible? Accessible shelters, making sure that those are accessible. And this is becoming a really big national issue, particularly after major disasters, 9/11 and Katrina, where people with disabilities were left out of that process. And so there's a lot of attention being paid on that front as it relates to the ADA compliance. We've also been working a lot on access to cultural venues, and a great initiative around working to make Chicago's cultural theaters, museum, zoos accessible, not just physically, but programmatically accessible to people with different types of disabilities who might be blind or low vision or deaf and hard of hearing. And then the other really exciting thing is, with the anniversary of the ADA, I've also been part of an initiative locally called ADA 25 Chicago, where we're working on a number of legacy initiatives and partner initiatives to get organizations and institutions all across the region to commit to kind of stepping up accessibility or inclusion or programming or funding to really move the needle forward for people with disabilities in this anniversary year. So on a personal level, the ADA has just dramatically changed my life. I was born with my disability. I've used a wheelchair all of my life. I grew up in a very pre-ADA generation. It was a time where there was, not to mention very low expectations for people with disabilities, but there was no curb ramps, so I could never cross the street independently as a wheelchair user. Even in high school, I remember my friends getting on the bus and not being able to get on the bus because there were no wheelchair lifts. You know, there was really little access to public accommodations and being carried up to stores and restaurants by family or friends and literally getting out of my wheelchair to crawl on the floor just to use the restroom. And even in my own school. And just accessibility was not in the consciousness whatsoever at the time, except I think, except by a growing number of disability rights advocates and activists who were making those parallels between disability rights and civil rights. So it was really a time where there wasn't a lot. And fast forward 25 years, I mean, this has happened literally in my own lifetime. I can get on virtually any bus in the country with a lift. I can use a bathroom with dignity. I can go to most stores and restaurants on my own. I can cross a street. So these are just very, very significant changes that, you know, I've seen and I've witnessed just in my own lifetime just because of this civil rights law. During my time, you know, as a commissioner, I've also seen many changes too. I remember like a couple of months just after being appointed by Mayor Daley, we got to make the announcement with CTA that all of the buses were now accessible with ramps and lifts, and not just that they were accessible, but they also had, you know, audio-visual announcements for passengers who are blind or deaf. I've seen many rail stations become accessible. We're definitely not there yet, but there's been a significant increase. We've installed over 58,000 new compliant curb ramps all across the city. I've seen parks become more and more accessible with accessible playground equipment. You know, I can go to some parks in Chicago and like with my daughter and go up to the top of the playground equipment because there's ramps and there's, you know, the surface is usable for a wheelchair user. So I've just seen so many changes just even in my time here in Chicago. And I think consciousness is very much increasing as well. More and more I'm seeing, you know, other city departments coming to us proactively and saying, hey, we want to do this better, or can you review this and give us input about how we can make sure that, you know, disability or accessibility issues are part of this. So that's, I think, changing significantly. And I think what's also helped is really getting great feedback from the disability community. I work a lot with Polman, I work a lot with Robin, just on, you know, what's wrong at the city level, what can we do better, what should we be doing better. And while I know a lot of us don't like complaints, I like complaints because they help us drive our agenda and tell us what's wrong and what we need to start fixing. So are we the most accessible city? Well, I mean, we've made a lot of progress. I will never say that we're done because there's still so much to be done. And I think all of us would agree that there's things that need to be done. And when I was asked the question in advance of this presentation, kind of what are some of the big challenges and what's the work remaining? I think some of the big challenges, you know, that we are an older city. So it takes longer to change the infrastructure, and it's more expensive to change it in a way that is accessible. I mean, I think the CTA is a great example. You know, you have a rail system that's over 100 years old, and you know, making some of these subway stations and elevateds are very costly. So we're not a new city that's just launching our first public transit system. So I think that that's, you know, a challenge. I think the weather is also a challenge. Many would agree, especially those of us with mobility disabilities, in terms of getting around. I don't think many cities have solved or cracked that issue of how we get compliance of people shoveling their sidewalks and, you know, making sure that every single bus stop and path of travel to a bus stop is accessible during, you know, in the aftermath of a snowstorm. So those are like constant challenges that we face every single winter with complaints and trying to figure out what we can do to improve that. And I just think some of the remaining issues, just, you know, looking at alternative ways that we can look at things like wayfinding, and like audible pedestrian signals and things like that for folks that are blind or low vision. Looking at more advances of what we can do to increase access to technology for folks with disabilities, and how can we also use technology to increase accessibility, I think is something that we as a city can be looking at doing more of. And then lastly, I know this isn't a physical access issue, but I think it's equally important, is I think the big next issue for the disability rights community is the issue of employment. And the fact that we've made so much progress with what I've just described even in my own lifetime as it relates to physical access, but employment remains the one nut that just hasn't been able to be cracked almost in 25 years since the ADA was passed. That we still have very high unemployment. In Illinois, approximately only 30%, 36% of working age adults with disabilities are working. And our poverty rate is double that of those without disabilities. So until we can really address the employment issues and bring people with disabilities out of poverty and be, active participants in their community, I think that we're not there, and the promise of the ADA hasn't lived up to what it needs to live up to. So I think that would conclude my remarks in terms of my reflections on the ADA of this anniversary, and I want to thank you for having me on this panel.
Fabulous. So Greg will speak next, but I failed to introduce Ruben, who is Greg's buddy over here. So Greg, if we can have you go next.
Are you insulted, Ruben? Anyway, as she mentioned, my name is Greg Polman. I'm Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Chicago Lighthouse for people who are blind or visually impaired. We're an old organization. We've been around since 1906. And we've been involved in a number of issues throughout that time. We started working on employment issues in about 1911 and so forth. But I'm not going to get into all of that because that's not my purpose today. But we do advocate for issues related to transportation, housing, and employment. And especially when it's in violation of someone's equal rights, and also to dispel a number of the myths that people have about people who are blind or visually impaired. Often what happens is that because our society is a very sight-oriented society, many times people cannot conceive how people who are totally blind or someone with partial vision can function or access their surrounding environment. And I think it's very important, and today's probably not the day to do it, but people as planners, urban planners, engineers, technicians, etc., should become familiar with some of the various eye conditions and functioning levels of people who cannot see, so that they can better understand when they're planning or building or coming up with a concept. As Karen mentioned, the Chicago Lighthouse is involved in many committees, councils, etc. And I think it's very important that when a city like Chicago or any city, when they're looking at ADA compliance, looking at changes within their infrastructure, that they involve the community, involve non-NGOs in the process, because you get a lot of input, you get a lot of variety of input, plus you probably will make wiser decisions. It's much better to make the change and make the change in the beginning than going back and retrofitting any type of structure. It'll cost you much, much more. Let me give you a prime example. I'm the vice chair of the Transit Access Committee, which is the RTA ADA, used to be the RTA ADA Committee. We brought to their attention when they're making an app, for an example, and we indicated to them that get the input from, especially the blind and visually impaired community, because of screen readers and other low vision devices, to make sure that the app works out of the box for all people. And so we are intimately involved with making sure that this modification or this accessible app is done right out of the box. Another, and there are a number of other items that we worked on with the RTA. One thing that I have the pleasure of doing along with other consumers and other NGOs, we can go to people, we can sit on committees with CARE, that Karen has asked us to join, and we don't have to say we'll just go with the minimal standards. Let's push the envelope and go beyond the minimum standard, or maybe come up with some new creative way to make something accessible. That way it makes everyone's lives much easier. I also sit on the ADA Advisory Committee for Transit. We're also working with Karen's group and the taxi community to come up with a talking, accessible credit card reader, and have screens where that somebody who's blind or visually impaired, they can touch the screen and they can hear how much the fare is, where they're, the location of the vehicle, and so forth. We're working out the details, within the next few months. This is where Karen said this is sort of a joint effort with NGOs, with consumers, with Commissioner Tamley's office, with the Commissioner of Bureaus and Licensing, Karen. We also work very closely with the Commissioner for the Department of Transportation. So you see how it all works, if everybody works together, compliance, and it makes everyone, not only people with disabilities' lives easier, it makes everyone's life easier, whether one is a senior or someone is pushing a stroller. The Lighthouse also worked very closely on I think it was 72,000 curb cuts that were put into the city over the past 5 years. And here you'd say, what input does one want from somebody, blind? I mean, it's a ramp for people in wheelchairs. It's important because the way a ramp is situated can throw, if it's at such a bad angle or not situated properly, someone who is blind using a cane possibly can not line themselves up properly to get across the street. I gotta make sure I don't go over my time allotment. I don't know if somebody is monitoring us.
I am.
Okay. I'm also working on, as far as wayfinding, I am in total agreement with Karen, and this is sort of my mantra, that you need to utilize the technology that's out there, Wi-Fi, beacon technology, GPS, within structures, so that if someone comes in and, for an example, into a subway system, in Washington, D.C., Washington worked with Columbus Lighthouse for the Blind, and they developed a beacon, using beacon technology, so that someone who's blind can maneuver throughout their entire transportation system using their cell phones. Isn't that cool? So again, here's another way, working together and getting ideas and using, new ways of thinking comes in handy. The Lighthouse is currently, as far as wayfinding, we are working with CTA in developing descriptive guides of the rail system. So what's going to happen, once the guides are completed, they're going to go out to their website and it can be downloaded so that someone can get can have a description of the L station before they get there. And they think this will also be very helpful to another group of people, or tourists that come into the city are apprehensive about taking public transportation. They can look online and feel more comfortable and make it more accessible.
Thank you. Molly?
Sure. I come from a little bit different perspective because I don't just focus on the city. I'm not, even though I live here and work here and such. Our project is part of a national, ADA national network. So there's 10 of us across the country covering different geographic area. I particularly cover the Great Lakes area, thus the Great Lakes ADA centers. So I travel extensively in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin in the work that I do. I'm also very involved in the ADA 25 national effort, and if you're not familiar with that, this is the banner, I brought it with me, that is the logo for ADA 25 Legacy, which has got its goal and its mission to celebrate what we've accomplished in the last 25, educate about what is and still needs to happen, and then to preserve the history, to look at what was the disability rights movement, what was it about, and kind of the preservation of that. So there's a tour that's going all over the country, and it is promoting this concept and really trying to re-energize people, because when you have civil rights laws like the ADA, what's great, we have the 25th anniversary, but what happens in 26 and what happens in 27 and what happens in 28, you don't just look at the 1 year that you're celebrating, but it's like it's an ongoing issue, and sometimes we forget that. And sometimes we feel complacent because we can look around and see that we've got curb cuts and things of that nature. But I'll tell you, my office gets calls on a regular basis from people because it's not in their neighborhoods. And if I do have a criticism and a comment about the city of Chicago, with all of the curb cuts and things of that nature that you talk about having been installed, when you go out into the neighborhoods, when you go out into where people are living, especially some of the low income and other areas, they don't have those curb cuts. They don't have them on their alleys. They don't have them on their streets. They've got crumbling sidewalks. They have just infrastructure issues in general, which makes it very difficult for people with disabilities to live and work in those neighborhoods. But when you talk at the housing and things of that nature, that's where the affordable housing is for a lot of people, is out in those neighborhoods. It's not downtown where we spend a lot of money to our tourism and to our public face, so it looks great in the Bean and it looks great at the, in the Loop and some of those areas. And I think that we do forget about the fact that we are a city, and that means we have a lot of boundaries and we have a lot of areas out there that people are living every day, and that's a continual barrier, and it's something that we can never stop becoming complacent in, while we celebrate the 72 or whatever the number is of curb cuts that have been put in. There's a huge number that still need to go in. When we look at where CTA serves, and while there are lifts on every bus that CTA has, we get calls all the time because of broken lifts. Buses that are being deployed when they shouldn't be, when there technically are policies within CTA of having them being checked and having them not go out of the bus garage unless they are. We know because we hear from people all the time. Now, whether it's real that they're not working, or it's the driver just stops because they don't want to take the time to pick that person up and tells them that their lift is not working, and wait for the next one. We don't always know that particular issue, but that is something that we hear on a regular basis. And so while I have a really good friend who we talk a lot about this kinds of things, and she'll remind me, she'll constantly say that, Robin, you're right. We do have, and we need to celebrate our accomplishments. But the reality is we still have a lousy transportation system for people with disabilities. So while it's better than it was 25 years ago, we can't forget that we do still have a long way to go, a lot of progress that still needs to be made, where we really can talk about equality for transportation in general. And I mean, there are people who would argue that probably that the city of Chicago doesn't have the greatest transportation system in general for everybody, you know, especially in some neighborhoods and things of that nature. But I think that sometimes there's a disparity there for people with disabilities. And I mean, we've seen those articles appear in the paper of recent where people are talking about some of the renovations being done on some of the stations, CTA stations and such, where they're not putting in lifts for whatever reasons, the cost issues and things of that nature. But, you know, the reality is for people who live in those neighborhoods, you know, that's a critical link. And there's so much that drives that economically and otherwise. Because, you know, Karen talks about the unemployment rate. Well, you know, you can't just look at unemployment, because if I don't have a place to live, that's in a safe environment, et cetera, then, you know, getting a job is my, you know, secondary thing. I mean, safety and having a place to live. If I don't have transportation to get to the job that's reliable, et cetera, then I'm not going to be able to maintain being employed and such. And if I don't have good education access and such to be able to get trained and get the skills I need to be able to be employable, then I'm never going to be successful in that area. So there's so many layers that you have to peel back in this process. So I think that we applaud all of the things that happen in the city, and I don't, you know, I think that, you know, what other city can I say as a model is it's better than we are? And I think you can pick out cities that might have, like Greg's, you know, talking about the transit system, the metro system in DC, having that system and being great. Well, so okay, you can focus on that, you know, thing about that city, and then another city might have, you know, great housing program, another city might have whatever. It's that kind of picking and choosing. I don't think there is any city that's great in everything, and I applaud and hope that Karen's office continues with the mayor or whoever wins the April election to you know, move Chicago forward in that mindset that it's, you know, the 25th. I'm sorry, that we're the most successful city in the country. But I do think we just have to continue to keep our eye on the game with the fact that it is good, but it's not great. It's better, but we're not there yet. And there still is a lot of inequity for people in where they live in their communities and where they have what they have access to. And so sometimes what happens in the press is you pick up all the good stuff. You know, you do all of those things, and you know, mayor, whoever's giving the presentation, talk about all the things that you have done. Let's talk about the things you haven't done yet that still, you know, need to be done. And you know, this issue of technology, you know, there still is a huge gap. I mean, it's gotten a lot better that more people with disabilities have access to technology, but we have to remember that, you know, we create technology as a way to bridge that gap, but then we have to figure out how do we get the technology to the person. How do we get that technology in their home? How do we get the technology in their pocket that they can use it? Because there's a cost associated with that technology. It's not something that everybody, you know, there are still a lot of people who have flip phones because they can't afford the smartphone. And you have to have the smartphone to do all these things we're talking about with apps and, you know, things of that nature. So how do we get that person that information and that stuff when they're living in poverty, as Karen talks about and such, and they can't afford the data plans or the things of that nature that it might require for me to access that gap. That you might be able to use, or that we'll be able to, you know, cut down on some of those barrier issues as we go forward and such. So, you know, as we celebrate and when we look at these things, it's not also, I get really frustrated about people telling me that they're in compliance with the ADA. Compliance is a legal term, and you know, compliance just means that, okay, if it push comes to shove and I go to court, the judge is going to say, did you follow the standard? Did you construct it that it was 32 inches wide and it was whatever, it was ever, okay, so yeah. So it is in compliance from that, you know, strict standpoint. But now I'm going to ask you about usability, and now I'm going to ask you about, you know, inclusiveness and such of that nature, because I can build a very accessible building that it meets all of the guidelines, but it becomes very unusable. As soon as somebody puts a garbage can in front of the controls to operate the elevator, or somebody doesn't shovel the sidewalk, or somebody does, you know, lets somebody put a bike on tie it to a railing that is supposed to be used for somebody to, you know, navigate and such, or somebody parks a car in the parking space that's not for, you know, that they don't have the right placard or whatever. It suddenly becomes unusable, even though it's in compliance. And I think that we kind of have focused too much sometimes on compliance and not really looking at the bigger picture about how is this supporting people living in the community? How is it sustaining people living in their communities, not just about being compliant? I mean, the laws are necessary. They are, you know, they're the stick, you know, that you can use if your rights have not been, you know, have been violated in one way or another, but it's too much that people hide behind that and don't really look at the bigger picture. We have tons of issues in the city with our small businesses. Go up and down Pilsen, go up and down any of our communities about the stores and the the owners of their stores who have no clue, have not received little to no information about the law or what their responsibilities are, or have been able to ignore it because there's nobody knocking on their door telling them otherwise. So what is a city like Chicago? And I understand it's a resource issue. It's the same at the federal level. Being able to look at compliance. But what do we do? When we're giving out business licenses? What comes into play in regards to also checking off those checklists about accessibility and what they know about the inclusion? And you can also get it bigger. And it's not just about disability, and it's about racial discrimination, and it's about other issues as well. But what are we doing as a community to really make sure that those people who are going to be hanging their shield out, or their shutters and things of that nature, that they really are including people with disabilities as potential customers? We still have that mindset in society that people with disabilities don't have money, that they aren't our valued customer or whatever else it might be. Well, people with disabilities still have to eat. People with disabilities still have to buy clothes. People with disabilities still have social relationships. People with disabilities do all those things. So they may not have the most money, but they're still out, spending money, and they're adding to the economy, and so they, have a right to have access. And also, people, it's over, the percentage is, well over a quarter of every family has at least one person with a disability in their family. So when you go out as a family and you go out to pursue, social events, or want to go visit family or friends and such, and it's a whole visibility concept of going into somebody else's home or going into somebody else's area. So we have a lot yet that needs to be done to really say that we have gotten to the point where people with disabilities are fully included in our society. It's not just about compliance with the law. It's really about our people with disabilities, getting their civil rights opportunities in that much broader perspective than just compliance with one piece of legislation or two pieces of legislation that's out there. So that's the challenge, I think, that we continue to have moving forward is, again, celebrate where we've been, continue to educate, but remember that we're not done. And it's great to have 25 years, but where will we be at 50? And I think that's our challenge to see where we're at. Great. Steve.
Thank you. Like my colleagues here, I'm not an expert on this topic, but it certainly has touched my career through most of my professional life. I first came to this issue back in 1980-something. I was under 40 then. And I was the government affairs manager for the CTA. And back then, the CTA was not governed by ADA, because ADA passed in 1990. It was governed by a law and regulations that sprung from, I think the legislation was called the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. So there was actually a predecessor law that attempted to deal with the barriers that people with disabilities have. The limitation of that law, however, is I think it was only applicable to the federal government or anything funded by the federal government, which certainly included the CTA. And what was interesting, I was really not sensitive to this issue when I came to the CTA. And the only perspective I heard was the CTA's perspective back then. And it was certainly one of not trying to be very compliant with the legislation if they could avoid it, because all they could think of was the cost that they were going to incur. And it was interesting, they were focused on the cost of retrofitting the existing system. And their alternative was to create a separate but equal system for those people with disability who could not access a fixed route system. And it's ironic because today, the expensive cost isn't so much the retrofitting anymore, it's the cost of paratransit, which is going to be enormous going forward. And I'm certainly not arguing against paratransit, it's something we continue to have to provide for, but it is a very expensive service that we need to figure out how to fund. And it was interesting back then, they did a study of the CTA. This shows you how I thought insensitive the CTA management was. They did a study that was mandated by federal law. And in that study, they were supposed to go out and show all the problems with retrofitting the existing system. And they took an able-bodied person and put that person in a wheelchair, and then went around showing how a person in a wheelchair could never access the system. Now, what a slight to the disabled community to have done that in that manner. Subsequent to CTA, I was fortunate to run the mayor's office in Washington for 3 years. And in 1990, Mayor Daley told me that one of your main priorities this year is to support the passage of the Americans with Disability Act. So kudos to Mayor Daley. He got it very early in life, I think primarily because of the experience with his son, Patrick, who has spina bifida and survived for a number of years, but died at an early age. And you know, he had no issue with creating a civil right for people with disabilities. It was interesting, at the same time, CTA hired a new general manager, Al Savage, who came with that old mentality that, no, we can't accommodate people with disabilities, it's way too expensive. Fortunately, he did not last very long. For a number of reasons, left that office, not with a great relationship with Mayor Daley. In 1990, it was a great experience for me personally in becoming more sensitive to the issue and learning that this was not just providing people with the privilege of access, it was providing them with a civil right of access to all public facilities. What was interesting about the approach on ADA as to how it was applied to transit back then is that it required both access to the bus vehicles and the train cars, but also to stations. And as Karen, I think, alluded to, on an old system like CTA, which is over 100 years old, to retrofit that is very expensive. And that was acknowledged by the law and by the subsequent regulations. So what was required of all rail transit systems in the country that were existing at the time is that they had, within a certain period of time, they had to provide access to all key stations on that system. And there's a regulatory process by which to determine what are key stations. And I think CTA is now fully accessible for its key stations. What's a challenge now is going forward and retrofitting all the other stations, and they must do that if they touch that station in any significant way to change its character or to do renovations of it. At a certain point, I'm not sure how to describe that, but at a minimum point, you have to make the whole station accessible. And I've never heard anyone at CTA, at least under Mayor Daley and continuing under Rahm Emanuel, complain about having to do that. It's just a matter of course, it's a matter of planning. It was interesting, just last week I was in Washington at a congressional staff meeting where they were talking about the challenges of transit. And not part of the hearing, but a sort of a side conversation with a manager from the system in New York, and they were talking about proactive efforts to make stations accessible. It was like going back to the 1980s again with them, and they were using outrageous numbers for how much it would cost them to put an elevator. And I'm sure it is very expensive, but it's not $200 million to put one elevator in a station. I'm sorry, but that was the fact that was being cited. So it's unfortunate that in the transit industry we still have sort of that narrow mindset. The other thing about ADA is that it requires complimentary paratransit service. So for those people with disabilities who because of their disabilities, cannot access the fixed route system, the transit system has to provide paratransit service that at least provides, well, Rosemary Gertie's here, she can correct me on this, but she's from the RTA and knows the regulations much better than I do. But at least we've been providing curb-to-curb service for our paratransit service, and with some accommodation getting to the curb, is that right?
Yeah, we go to the door if the person needs it. Yeah.
If the person needs it.
Yeah.
And that was, by the way, just re-emphasized, I think, in a rule that came down from USDOT yesterday about providing reasonable accommodations beyond ADA for people with disabilities on the transit system. And it applies only to basically the bus system. So it does not, this requirement does not require full coverage of the entire region. We have what we call ADA paratransit deserts throughout the suburbs because you only have to provide it within a half mile, 3/4 miles of the line. And so, fixed route line. So when you look at a map of ADA in the suburbs, there's vast areas of the suburbs where there are people living who have disabilities and cannot use transit at all. So that's an important issue in terms of advancing what more we can do to make our transportation system better. And I would agree with your assessment in that regard. I was fortunate after leaving Washington to have worked on a major project for the City of Chicago. It's called the Central Area Circulator Project. And at the time, we never built it, but it was going to be a light rail system for downtown Chicago. And we were very much looking forward to making the first fully accessible, low-floor, accessible light rail system in the country. In fact, we could not find good examples in this country. We actually had to go to Europe to find how such vehicles were deployed on systems over there. And so in many respects, there's many other countries that were ahead of us, at least on the transit front, in terms of accessibility. Going back to paratransit, paratransit, as I said, is a very expensive service. What is it, Rosemary? $42, $45 per trip now, and we recover less than 10% through the fare because we cannot charge more than twice the bus fare, I think.
Yeah, non-discounted.
Yeah, so technically we could probably charge $4.50, but we don't charge that, do we? We charge something more like $4 or something like $3. And the demand for the service is going to grow. I mean, with the aging boomers, we are becoming disabled and unable to use the system, and that is going to put a strain on paratransit and find the money to expand that. It was interesting that PACE now runs the entire ADA service for the region. At one time, it was split between CTA and PACE, and CTA had its own paratransit service just for its service area, and PACE had the suburban area. And the interesting politics of that was that the cost of change was CTA needed operating assistance back in 2004, and the legislature did not want to give CTA the money. They just didn't trust CTA with the money, which is an unfortunate characteristic of the CTA with the legislature. But so instead, they came up with the idea, let's relieve CTA of the paratransit cost, shift that to PACE, and then give PACE the money to subsidize paratransit. That actually took about $60 million off of the CTA budget. But when PACE got that service, and they reviewed how well it was performing in the city, and they went to every ward, had public hearings in every ward, to determine that, they found many improvements needed to be made if they were going to be at least ADA compliant. So I don't mean to criticize CTA, but they were not ADA compliant. And in fact, our assessment, my assessment at the RTA when I was running the RTA was that they were really using non-compliance to keep their costs down, which is unfortunate. I mean, and that's, I mean, the cities, the CTA and the transit system overall is sorely underfunded. So I'm not surprised that was the circumstance. But in any case, PACE, I think, has done a great job in improving that service, making it fully compliant. And continuing trying to improve it to make it more efficient and effective in serving that community. Another interesting aspect of the ADA as it applies to transit, though, is that it doesn't cover commuter rail, except for the vehicles. But there was no complimentary paratransit service required for the commuter rail line. And it was amazing back when I was at the RTA, and I would listen to the executive director of Metro say, paratransit is not my responsibility. Don't take my money to pay for that. I mean, talk about a team player. And that's actually a problem with our existing system is that we're divided between three service boards, and they don't necessarily look at themselves as part of a regional system or have a regional perspective. A couple other points I wanted to cover. Oh, well, in terms of dealing with this cost, I think it was referred to by Robin, and that we really need to look to new technologies constantly. And I was talking to the new shared Mobility Center that we have here in Chicago. That's a national center. And they're actually looking into how the shared mobility service or business models could be applied to ADA and to paratransit. So, for instance, if you have a family that has an ADA accessible vehicle that they use for their family, why couldn't that vehicle also be put in service to serve other people at the same time? And that person who owns the vehicle could benefit by being paid to provide their vehicle. So that's just one idea that's out there that's interesting, and I'm sure there's many more technological improvements that could be brought to bear overall in that regard. Another important thing, and actually something that we're doing at UTC, is we're trying to assist the Chicago Public Schools with their travel training that they provide to students. And it's very important, and this is being acknowledged, and I think New York City is probably the model for this. It's very important to intercept, to focus on the transportation mobility needs of our children, and to try and get them to adapt to fixed route service. Because really, if they could use that service, that is the best service available. Paratransit is not the best because it usually requires 24-hour
Reliance on other people.
Yeah, relying on other people, exactly. The other thing, so we have to expand that. I mean, we have to have more effective grade school programs and high school programs to intercept these students and get them to feel comfortable using fixed route service for the rest of their lives. And then, and this was alluded to earlier, there's the first and last mile issue. Yeah, I agree, we've done a lot with curb cuts and other things, but as was mentioned, there's always you're going to find some barrier within that last mile or first mile that you take to try and get to a fixed route. So that's something that transit systems have to partner with municipalities on to ensure that we address that.
We've heard very great things about what have been some of the results of and improvements because of the American with Disabilities Act. What do you think have been some of the impacts of ADA on the built environment itself? How is the built environment different now because of ADA? Any thoughts on that?
Well, actually, in some ways, I think what's being done to accommodate access for people with disabilities in the fixed route system, for instance, the CTA, has made it easier for everyone to use. I mean, whatever, it's great when I'm carrying a heavy bag, travel bag with luggage, to have an elevator there to get up to the system. So, this is something that I think that everyone's benefited from in terms of the accessible improvements to that system. The kneeling of the buses. I had a bad knee the other day, and it was great to know that bus was going to kneel for me, even though it's a temporary issue for me. Everybody has those issues, so it's really, the accessibility. We shouldn't think of this as just a special accommodation necessarily for those people with disabilities. It's accommodating all of us in our needs, because in any given day we need assistance with our transportation.
Any other thoughts on that?
I'd say the one area we get complaints about is that how it's been a negative is the bathrooms, because architects and designers don't like to put a lot of money and time into bathrooms unless it's something that is a showcase for that particular venue.
Yes, we women have
But because of the requirements for accessible toilet stalls, the other stalls tend to shrink because you have to meet your square footage for that accessible toilet stall within that footprint of what's being allocated for the bathrooms in that building. And then all the other stalls, because there aren't really standards per se for those other stalls, they become narrower and shorter. And so we get the complaint from people then that everyone wants to use the accessible stall because it's larger and it provides more room for my suitcase or whatever I might be, or I have a kid with me or whatever. And so it's like the architects haven't necessarily adapted to understanding that it's in addition to, it's not within that same space, because it does drive people to use the stall, which then is a negative because people with disabilities who need that stall don't have it available because others are using it as an attractive attractive feature. But I do think that we're still trying to move more and more of our designers and planners to more the concept of universal design. Let's get away from just thinking again of it being compliant and what makes it usable for everybody, and so why does it need stairs at all? I mean, stairs are limiting as to who can use the stairs. So when you start to look at things being, sloped, or you think, looking at grade and stuff that nature, everyone without adaptation. So if you think about it in the context of, we could eliminate a lot of the special need or special use if we looked at it from more of a universal design concept that everyone can use something without having to have special accommodation or special designations or things of that nature. Attached to it. So it's still something it's hard for people to grapple with that because it sometimes does require more space allocation or, a different thought in regards. There's something about architects and designers and stuff. They love staircases. They love whatever they bring in. They love the barristers, banisters and things and all that, they can do with them and, cool designs of nature. So there's still a challenge out there in building buildings and such to think in a more universal perspective of things side by side or eliminating certain things altogether. Like doors are my biggest pet peeve with the entrances, the whole concept of the entrance, and then so you're going to have the fancy revolving door entrance, and then you're going to put the little entrance that's a accessible entrance to the side or off in a kind of awkward position, and it's not part of the main. Why isn't the main doorway
It's usually locked.
Fully, yeah, right, it's locked, or it has some special whatever on it, type of thing. That still remains, a pet peeve to me in the standards being allowed some of those things to be there. But then that's what happens. The designers use those things to continue to create barriers that don't need to be there. You are differentiating who gets to use which entrance by doing those things.
Greg, your commissioner, did you want to add anything?
No,
I just wanted to mention, one thing I think is really an added addition to buildings and infrastructures are talking elevators, and also the braille in the elevator. I was, though, in a building the other day, they had elevators on both sides. The one side, the elevator talked on the way up, and I went down on the other side, and none of the elevators talked on the other elevator bank. So I don't know why, but I mean it's a really good, helpful feature.
So
I think
the
it
examples,
reminds- I
universal
think-
design.
I think it reminds two people that are in the elevator looking at their phone or daydreaming that 16th floor, okay, better get off.
Same on the trains, right?
Steve, do you want to add something?
Greg, you reminded me of something, because I actually use the bus station on Roosevelt, right near the Lighthouse building there. And the other day I was reminded that we have a long way to go with all of our intersections, really, because only there is an audio sound for someone with sight hearing. And nowhere else can I think of in the city is that found. I mean,
Yeah, that's one of the things that Karen and a bunch of us are working on. This is one of the things that they don't have all the codes or regulations done for, but they really need audio pedestrian signals. And one of the reasons I got a dog guide was cities have become so noisy, and I heard Chicago is ranked way up there now as far as, 58 decibels or something. But cars are so much quieter, there's so much noise in the environment, it's very difficult for someone who's blind to often hear when the light changes. Back in the day, you just use the sound of the cars surging, because if you don't know, you usually rev your engine a little bit, and that's how we knew that we could go. But I think it's a crucial and very important, and I think they're very important, I think, here again for sighted and other people, because to know that they can now walk, because people just walk at will.
Yes, they do.
Commissioner?
I think that there's certainly been a lot of changes in the built environment that we've talked about, but I think the key thing now is just the maintenance of those accessible features. Too often I go to restaurants or public accommodations that have the lift to go up to the front and they can't find the key, or it's broken. And I went to one a couple of months ago at a mayor's event, and the guy was like literally jumping on the lift to try to get it running. Things like the lock side doors, which are very, very common. You know, everybody can get through the revolving door, but the side door is typically locked. Or the path of travel to get somewhere has boxes, or, as was mentioned, bikes locked up on the ramps that make it really difficult. Oftentimes, the lowered counters that they have aren't usable for people using wheelchairs because they put all their junk on there, and that happens time and time again. And then elevators too, like, you know, whether it's at a rail station or something, the maintenance of those accessible features, I think, are just as important as making them available in the first place. And then talking about curb ramps too, something could have been compliantly installed, but then over time with weather conditions and freeze and thaw and trucks rolling over it, it deteriorates over time and then becomes completely unusable for someone with a disability and dangerous as well. So I think that maintenance of those accessible features is really critical.
Do you have any questions or follow-up of one another? Okay, we can open it also. Go ahead.
I wanted to make a comment about accessibility and transportation. One of the areas that, and this isn't, one of the areas that needs a lot of work are taxis and taxi drivers as far as service animals. Actually, I was going, about 6 o'clock yesterday morning, I had to go to Union Station, and my doorman got a cab to front of the building, and before I could come out of the lobby, the guy said, no, I'm allergic. I said, so am I, and I hopped in the cab and had to take me. But cabs will pass people by that have service animals. One of Karen's staff members, who is a wheelchair user, has told me many times, he says that often cabs will go right by him because he is a wheelchair user, not knowing that he has the ability to transfer into a cab, doesn't need a van, so forth and so on. But that's a piece of transportation that needs a lot of people who are in that industry need a lot of education. I just actually did a interview with whatever they call their taxi cab dispatch or whatever their newspaper last week, and I'm kind of curious to see how it turned out. They're supposed to be publishing it in the next, either I think in their April edition. But I talk about some of these issues that people should have a right, no matter who they are, to rent a cab if you have the dollars to pay for it.
Well, Commissioner, your office has talked a lot about the city of Chicago being the most accessible city in the country. And Robin, you work with folks from across the country, and I think you even made, maybe with Steve, you made reference to people in other countries that are doing some things. What can you tell us about how Chicago compares to what other cities are doing, or how we might learn from some of these other cities? Commissioner?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say we're like the most accessible. I think Robin talked about there's different parts of accessibility that each city shines at or doesn't do so well at. That's our aspirational goal, is to be the most accessible city. So I think that there's certainly things that you can look at in any country or any city that have really great models. And we're always trying to see what other cities do where we can follow that. One of the things I organize is a monthly phone meeting with all the MOPDs in major cities around the country. So I have New York and Boston, Philadelphia, and LA and San Francisco, and we spend an hour every month just talking about what are your challenges, what are some of the great things you've done. We have kind of an internal list group where we share, everything from best practices to policies to photographs to lawsuits to everything, to try to learn from each other about what we can do, and oftentimes looking at adopting, a legislation or a policy or something you've done on cabs or, complete streets or bike lanes and its impact on people with disabilities, or bus rapid transit, or paratransit, or housing. And so I think it is really important to constantly be pushing yourself and looking to other models that are out there. And again, I would say that's our aspirational goal, is to be the most accessible city, but you know, there's still a long way to go to make sure that all aspects of the city are fully accessible.
Janet?
Given that it is the anniversary of the ADA and remembering when it was passed and actually trying to deal with implementing it around public housing and finding it a very complex and conflicting, actually, legislation. I think there were probably reasons for that, and other people know more than I do. But thinking about this now, it's 25 years later, and what are we looking to do that can change or improve the ADA, improve on that? So taking into consideration what we know now, good intentions sometimes lead to bad outcomes, and there's things that we might want to do differently. Are there recommendations or things that you all would put out there? And besides, you mentioned many things that are dealing with sort of the concrete or the technical things, but just as a body of legislation, like what could we do to make it better?
Enforcement is a huge problem. You know, when you have such a large law that encompasses such a large body of things, historically in this country, we just, our enforcement mechanisms do not keep pace with the legislation. So you look at the agencies, whether it be the Department of Justice, or whether it be a Department of Transportation, or whether it be an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or whoever, they don't have the resources, they don't have the local structures, you know, to be able to do that. And plus, it's also very dependent upon the administration. And so we saw under certain administrations of the recent past where almost nothing happened in the enforcement arena. And if you talk to the people in leadership, they would tell you they were told they couldn't do anything by that administration. And then, you know, so that we still have that, how do I exercise my rights? You know, how do I do that? And I think one of the strongest things to do is to look to your local. You know, while you have the federal law, the more you can do to strengthen your local laws to be equivalent or greater than that's the latitude you have locally, then you have local enforcement. Because, you know, it is, I mean, who cares out in Washington, D.C. what happens in Chicago? You know, maybe because you have Obama from here or something, you might have some, you know, heightened awareness of Chicago, but it really isn't the priority of X agency or X department to know what's happening here. And so when complaints get filed from citizens of Chicago out in Washington, D.C., you're in the pile of 50,000 other complaints that are coming in. Whereas if you look at local mechanisms that you can get real, where people are actually here, they see this issue, they understand the issue, you know, they're faced with the issue, I can go and face them if I want to. It's hard for me to fly out to D.C. to see somebody in the, you know, Department of Justice, but I can go downtown and see somebody at the Human Rights Commission, or I can go into the, you know, JTRC and see somebody from, you know, the Capital Development Board, or whoever, you know, is in that enforcement realm. So I think that's a really important issue. And I mean, I think Illinois has done that to a certain degree. I mean, our Illinois Accessibility Code has historically had areas of it that are more stringent, that have been because of advocacy at the local level. Parking as an example, our parking spaces are bigger in Illinois for accessibility than they are anywhere else in the country, because our state law requires them to be bigger than the ADA requires. I mean, that's just an example. There's other things. I mean, our door forces as to how heavy a door is, you know, is greater in Illinois, is lesser than Illinois than it is, you know, right at the federal level. So I think that, you know, when you start to look at what fits your community, what is needed in your community, and then start to get that enforcement arm. But of course, then the resources have to come with that, because you can't enforce without the resources to do that. And then, of course, having attorneys and others that will take ADA cases or discrimination cases is a whole nother arm of it. You know, you can have discrimination occurring, but if I can't get anybody to help me through the process or to represent me in the process, then it's very difficult for me to do that. So I think that enforcement is, and there was a report done at the 20th anniversary of the ADA that was commissioned at the federal level looking at these issues by the Civil Rights Commission. That was the one thing that stuck out, was the enforcement was one area across all agencies that was a weakness under the ADA. I would say if they did the same thing today, they wouldn't have found the meter to change it at all. And, you know, in there, I think it's still a big problem.
You have a question, sir?
Oh yeah, I was wondering if you guys could talk about the role of education to professionals, and also and I guess just thinking of dissemination of information, both at the professional level. You guys talked about how designers and different people have don't always don't always design things in the right way. And I served with Greg on the CTA ADA advisory board, and they had the policies and they had the ADA coordinator, but some of these new stations that they designed, there were just certain things that they got to the minimum, but they didn't really they didn't put in a automatic door, or they didn't do these things to go and make it so that people can really live independently in the community and use transit in the right way. And so, I guess what is the thinking in terms of education of professionals, dissemination of information, and also to the other way, dissemination of information to end users, right? You guys talked about technology as being this other component that could really help move beyond the ADA. So how, you talked about one of the barriers is cost, but I think another one that I've seen is not knowing about what's out there. And it's hard to keep up with all this technology, and what is, how can the adoption of that technology happen, be implemented? It sounds kind of broad, but.
Can I tell you this is an interesting project that the Lighthouse is involved with, and people across the United States. 3 years ago, the Federal Communications Commission decided to put money into bridging the digital gap for people who are deafblind or severely hearing and visual impaired, dual sensory impaired. And we're coming to the end of the third year at the end of the project, and people on my staff have given out many iPhones and Androids and Braille displays and web to Androids, and trained and evaluated and assessed and all sorts of whatever. But in this particular campaign, they did a national push. It's called I Can Connect, and they did a push across the country to try and educate and do outreach for that. Well, this is for a particular population, and to different medical groups, etc., to try to locate the individuals so that they can have the tools in their hand in order to access telecommunications and other communications. I mean, that doesn't totally answer your question, but it is a project that has been pretty successful across the country.
Okay. Anyone? I think you have to get to the mainstream. I think you have to get down to the place that people get their information from and figure that out. Now, everybody has access to the internet. So, we've gotten some now that, put it on your website. I disseminated it, I put it on my website. There are still a large population of people that don't have everyday access to the internet, and need to get that information in other ways. So it's that not single modal, communication, but multimodal communication. Like, sure, do it on your website, but also flyers still work. Dissemination in church bulletins and in community newsletters and things of that nature still is a way to get that information. I think we sometimes have given up some of those other ways, old-fashioned ways, but we are missing low-income, unconnected people not being able to get information because they don't have the PSAs, the TV, the radio, some of those old-fashioned mechanisms. It's not all about Instagram and Facebook and whatever, but
Don't you want to do a YouTube?
Yeah, we're doing a YouTube thing. Education's huge. I mean, I still am very discouraged when I hear, even here, like in our architecture school or whatever, that only a couple of hours total in the curriculum is spent on some of the things. But you know what it's spent on? It's spent on compliance. Because I have to take a test before I can get my licensure, license or whatever, to know certain things about the law. There's a difference between compliance and using and user end. Okay, compliance is a legal thing, and the user experience is a very different thing that is wrapped with compliance. And I'm not sure enough time is spent to really have people understand why an automatic door is important, because the law doesn't tell you you have to have an automatic door. So the fact that that person designed the station without an automatic door, they were in compliance.
Right.
Okay, but that doesn't mean it's usable for people. So you have to understand where those other things are and fit in. And I don't think we spend enough time really having that experience. And so I think that gets into, not bringing enough of people into the community with the experiences of the user. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how important those capstone projects and things are that actually put you in connection with the community, which actually puts you with who the people that you're going to be working with. When I, look at our management school here that, teaches on HR, and I've done guest lectures in there, and the amount of time that they spend on talking about the ADA and in the HR area, it's about how to not get sued for doing the wrong thing. That's the wrong part of what you should be teaching in that program. You should be really teaching more about the diversity of different types of candidates and what you would do for accommodations and things, not how to stay out of trouble, And so I think that they're still in our education realm. I also think, I reflect on, I do a lot of education in this area. Let's look at our student body. How many people with disabilities are in our student body? How diverse is our own student body in regards to that? Because not until we get actual people with disabilities into some of these professions who are actually out there and leading some of these professions, whether there are professors, whether there are, there are CEOs or CFOs or whatever it is, you're not going to also make those changes. So I think we have a lot yet to be done in that arena to infuse more, and I think we just have to be really diligent about it, keep up with it. I mean, that's, I think, a challenge in the next 25 years. Is
Well, that's a really great point to highlight the viewpoint of the user and how the user can really change how things are done. And when you think about, School of Architecture or Design,
Or planning.
there's meant to be a lot of
there you
creativity.
go, those planning people.
There's meant to be a lot of creativity that usually goes into the thoughts about these designs. And if you're absence the opportunity to be creative, you're not going to come up with a creative solution, right? So other questions back there?
So I just want to make a comment here and thank Robin for clarifying. I'm Michelle Garcia, I work tracking for me. We've been doing workshops within the Latino community to educate, or so we thought, business owners, small business owners for that, about making their business compliant with the ADA. But the clarification came just now, turned the light bulb on, about the user versus the, not get sued piece. So I was telling, these are the members of my group that I organize. Cambiando Vidas is the Latino group that I organize. Like I said, we're trying to educate the community or the business owners on how to be compliant, but then it turned in my head, evolved and said, oh, so you're telling them basically how not to get sued. And so what comes then to us, they're like upset because they're like, we're not gonna do it. So they're like kind of upset at us rather than learning on, oh, this is why we want to do it. So they haven't done, excuse the language, but so we actually want to educate them on why the importance of, being accessible, which is all along what we need to do, and we thrive to be doing. And also because they're small business owners and they've been telling us, and we know this, small business owners don't have, the funding or they don't have the money to do it. The elevator piece, we have a business that has been doing what they can to make their business accessible because of us, because we work with them. But they have a second floor and they're trying to figure out how to put an elevator into their, so we can have access to that second floor. And they're like, it's too expensive, how do we do this? But they've been trying to work with us, and we are so grateful to them, and we do events there and whatever to try to help them out. And they help us out as well. But, so this is a great, even though I don't know most of the stuff, it's always a great refresher, like the light bulb that turned on. So thank you all.
Great. I feel like I want to end on that note, although I have maybe a quick last question on whether or not you see some of these issues played out in gender terms. Are there differences for men and women on some of these issues? Are there ways that maybe we can think also about how this affects women and children, and other aspects of gender differences? Any thoughts on that? No, so.
I mean, bathroom parity's always been an issue.
Yeah.
Are your stalls bigger?
No.
I want to make a comment that just about gender is, about guide dogs. I would say in the past, probably year and a half, I've had more questions about coming into a place with my dog than I ever have in the 16 years I've been a dog user. And I think a lot of it has to do with, a lot of people are walking around with what is known as the fake service animal.
Yep. Yep.
And so restaurants and stuff, people come in with these animals and they're disruptive, they're urinating on the floor and all of that, they pass them off, they sometimes have papers and
Harnesses.
Buy them off, you can buy a kid online.
and all of that, and that causes a real, I don't know, a dog ender issue. But it has become a problem, and that's why the ADA went to only dogs and horses, because people were using snakes and rabbits and whatever else, ferrets. And that is an issue, and it makes it difficult as a user, dog user, to do certain things. I mean, it's not a constant, but one time I was getting on an L and I had to pass the driver of the train that pulled up because I was too far ahead. And he kind of questioned whether or not, because Reuben is a standard poodle, he wasn't a lap, so therefore he was not a service animal. And so I just got on the L, but I mean but I just think these are things that cause problems for people with disabilities when people do things like this. Do you have other?
One final, last comment from each of you, and then we'll wrap this up. Commissioner, we'll start with you on that end.
I think it's already been stated, but a lot of progress the last 25 years, a lot more to go in the next 25.
I think the cost issue is pervasive. The technology is there to better assist people. It's just not affordable. Also, and it applies even to a situation where we're in teaching in schools. I have a daughter who's a special ed instructor, and she felt like she was an assistant to the mainstream teacher because they didn't have enough money for them to develop, a class together. She was always following easily, and the kids treated her that way, as if she wasn't that important. So it was a cost issue. They just don't have the money for that.
So the cost issue continues to be something we need to overcome. Robert?
Some ways you're the choir. You came here because you probably maybe already know something or whatever, but I think that there are a lot of people out there who don't know this stuff, and we all serve as a voice about the ADA, about the rights of people with disabilities, about the dignity and such that goes along with one having your rights and being exercised rights. So as we celebrate the 20th anniversary, please engage in activities to get the message out there to people. One of the things that's great about an anniversary, it does give you kind of an opportunity to kick a little bit when things go along. You get kind of complacent sometimes, when things are kind of going wrong. And the anniversaries give you an opportunity to reflect and then kind of, re-examine and then, kind of get re-energized for moving forward. So take the message out to those around you that it is the 25th anniversary of the ADA. Celebrate what has been done, but also recognize we have a long way yet to go, and engage them in that process of whatever you do in your professional or personal lives.
And my final word is, and I've said this during my presentation, I think it's very important as planners, architects, etc. out there that you utilize the NGOs in the community, engage the consumers of people who are disabled, use them in discussing when you're putting together a thought or an idea. They may come up with a more creative design than you. Mm-hmm. And I think just engaging the community and experts will make your lives in everyone else's lives much easier. It's easier to make something right the first time instead of retrofitting it. And let Ruben in whenever you can.
I want to thank UIC's Disabilities Resource Center for their co-sponsorship of this event with Great Cities Institute. I want to thank all of you for coming. Steve Schlickman, Robin Ann Jones, Greg Polman, and Ruben, and Commissioner Karen Tamley. Thank all of you for spending your time with us. We appreciate it. And you've certainly given us a lot of information, and we will go forward and spread the word. I also want to really take note of the GCI staff. Jack and Jacqueline, thank you for listening to the series. And thank you, Margaret. Thanks all.